real challenge came when Luciano's men tried to push into the numbers game, one of Bumpy's most profitable rackets. They thought they could make a deal, threaten him into submission, or worse, cut him out entirely. What they didn't realize was that Bumpy didn't need to play by their rules. He had something they didn't. He had Harlem. And Harlem wasn't a place you could control with money or guns. Harlem was a place you controlled with respect. And Bumpy had earned that respect one way or another. Sal's move to pull a gun on Bumpy that night wasn't the first attempt. It was the culmination of months of escalating tension, of territorial disputes and ignored warnings. Luciano's men had pushed Bumpy far enough that night to think they could take him out, but they didn't know who they were dealing with. The room was heavy with tension as Sal and his associates closed the distance, their footsteps echoing like the ticking of a clock, each second louder than the last. The air was thick with the weight of Bumpy's gaze and the silent promise of a reckoning. Sal's hands were still trembling slightly around the gun, but his arrogance didn't waver. He thought he had the upper hand. He thought that Bumpy was finally going to fold under pressure, as so many others had before him. But Bumpy wasn't just another gangster. He wasn't the kind of man who crumbled under intimidation, no matter how many guns were pointed his way. The only thing that moved was his eyes, scanning the room, locking with those around him. His demeanor was unshaken, calm, poised, in full control. There was no fear in his body, no sign of hesitation. For a moment, it seemed like the world had stopped. Every eye in the room was on Bumpy, watching his every move, waiting to see how the legend would react. "You think you can just walk in here and point a gun at me?" Bumpy's voice cut through the stillness like a blade. His words were slow, deliberate. "You think that's going to end well for you?" Sal's hand tightened on the grip of his gun, but his eyes flickered to Bumpy's face, realizing too late that the man across from him was not the one to be intimidated. Bumpy sat in his chair with the kind of quiet confidence that came only from a lifetime of surviving in the worst parts of the world. He didn't need to stand. He didn't need to raise his voice. The very air around him seemed to bend to his will. And Sal, in that moment, felt it. He felt the weight of Bumpy's reputation, the legacy of the streets, the respect that came with the name Bumpy Johnson. Without breaking his gaze, Bumpy reached under the table, his hand brushing against the cold steel of the razor blade hidden there. The motion was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to send a shiver down Sal's spine. The men with him shifted uneasily, a subtle flicker of doubt crossing their faces. "You point a gun at me, Sal. You better be ready to pull the trigger," Bumpy continued, his tone still calm, but laced with something deeper, something darker. "But if you don't, then we'll have a different conversation." Sal's finger hovered on the trigger, but for a fleeting moment, he hesitated. His confidence began to wane. He had underestimated Bumpy. He thought that years of distance between them meant Bumpy was no longer the man to be feared. But the streets had a way of reminding you of your place, and Bumpy was the living embodiment of that reminder. Before Sal could react, the moment came like a flash of lightning in the night. Bumpy's hand shot forward, swift and precise, and in an instant, the razor was in his grip. Sal's gun was still pointed at Bumpy, but the standoff had already shifted. In one fluid motion, Bumpy stood, his body language like a coiled spring ready to snap. The razor flashed in the dim light, a quick and deadly arc aimed straight for Sal's face. It was a move that had been perfected over years on the streets, a move that left no room for hesitation. In a blink, the razor was at Sal's throat, the sharp edge pressed against his skin. The room held its breath. Sal's eyes went wide, his hand still frozen with the gun aimed at Bumpy. He was caught, locked in a stare with the legend himself. It was the kind of moment that could break a man, salvation slipping from his grasp in a fraction of a second. "Go ahead," Bumpy said, his voice low and dangerous, his words laced with finality. "Pull the trigger. Do it." Sal's body trembled, the reality of the situation sinking in. He wasn't in control anymore. The power had shifted. All those years of building an empire, of trying to outlast men like Bumpy, had been brought to this. One razor-sharp moment. The silence was deafening, and then the sound that broke it all was the soft thud of the gun falling from Sal's hand to the floor. His face was pale, his mouth dry, his body shaking. He had lost. He knew it. The tables had turned, and the price for underestimating Bumpy Johnson had just been paid. Bumpy stepped back slowly, letting the razor slip from Sal's throat as he turned toward his men. The room exhaled as one, the tension finally breaking. The legend had spoken, and the mob had learned a lesson. As Sal's men scrambled to collect their fallen comrade, their earlier bravado evaporated. The weight of the situation hit them hard. The guns they'd pointed at Bumpy were now useless, their threats nothing more than hollow gestures in the face of the legend who stood before them. Bumpy didn't look back. He wasn't interested in what came next for them. He had made his point. The man who thought he could walk into Harlem and challenge Bumpy Johnson had just been shown what happened to those who underestimated him. The other patrons of the club, who had been holding their breath in fear moments earlier, began to relax. A subtle nod from Bumpy, a glance that acknowledged the crowd without looking directly at them, was all it took for the atmosphere to change. The whispers died down, the conversations resumed, and the room returned to its natural state of order. But one thing had changed. The mob had learned the hard way. There was a line you didn't cross, and Bumpy Johnson was that line. The men from Luciano's camp, still shaken and humbled, retreated without a word. There would be no further confrontation tonight. The respect they had once taken for granted was now something they had to earn, something that didn't come just by wielding guns and power. But Bumpy had already said what needed to be said. Bumpy Johnson didn't need to say another word to solidify his status. The silence in the room spoke volumes. The respect that was earned through years of hard work, loyalty, and calculated action had been reaffirmed in the most dramatic way possible. No longer was Bumpy just another street boss in Harlem. In that moment, he was the man who made the power players of the mob stand down with nothing more than a single glance and the sharpest of threats. It wasn't just the razor that had sealed his legend that night. It was the unwavering confidence, the absolute control he exuded, even when his life was at risk. He wasn't a man who relied on fear alone. His strength lay in his mind, in his ability to read situations and people with a precision that others simply didn't have. Bumpy wasn't just a gangster, he was a tactician, a king in his own right, and everyone who was lucky or foolish enough to cross him would know it. For the mob, this moment was a wake-up call. Luciano's men, powerful as they were, had been forced to retreat into the shadows, nursing their bruised egos. But it wasn't just the mob that learned a lesson that night. Harlem was watching too, and to the people in those dark alleys and storefronts, Bumpy's reputation as a man who demanded respect and who could deliver justice with ruthless efficiency was solidified. The ramifications of that encounter rippled through Harlem's streets in ways that couldn't be measured immediately. In the world Bumpy inhabited, things weren't always about instant retribution or explosive acts of violence. No, in Bumpy's world, power was a constant. It was a steady, undeniable force that didn't need to prove itself, just like the calm after a storm. It wasn't the threat of violence that made people fear Bumpy. It was the certainty that he would act when necessary, and that the consequences of crossing him would be swift and absolute. The mob would learn to respect the man who had just turned their own weapon against them without ever breaking a sweat. And Harlem's residents, who had long depended on Bumpy for protection, for work, for order, would remember this moment, not just as a testament to his physical power, but to his unshakable position as a protector of their streets. For Bumpy, the justice had been served. There was no need for more. He knew better than anyone that in this world, respect was not something you begged for. It was something you took, and sometimes you had to take it with blood. Bumpy didn't bask in the aftermath. He didn't need to. His legacy was never about grand speeches or dramatics. His legacy was in his actions. It was in how he had the courage to stand up when others would have folded. It was in how he made those who dared to challenge him recognize that no matter who they were, no matter how much power they had, they would never be more than a footnote in Bumpy's story. The confrontation that night wasn't just another chapter in Bumpy Johnson's saga. It was a turning point, one of the defining moments that would forever shape how he was remembered in Harlem and beyond. In the years that followed, there would be more confrontations, more challenges to his authority, but none of them would carry the same weight as the moment when Luciano's men thought they could intimidate him and failed. The moral of this story isn't just about standing up to bullies or about demonstrating physical power. It's about understanding that true power doesn't come from a gun, a razor, or a reputation built on fear. True power comes from confidence. It comes from the unwavering belief that no matter what the world throws at you, you will stand firm, unyielding, and unbroken. Bumpy's story is one of respect. It's about the power of loyalty, the weight of one's word, and the understanding that integrity above all else is what truly builds a legacy. The legend of Bumpy Johnson isn't just the tale of a man who controlled the streets. It's the tale of a man who commanded respect, even from those who were supposed to be his enemies. And as for Luciano's men, the message was clear. You may have your guns, your money, your influence, but none of that will save you when you step into Bumpy Johnson's world. In Harlem, respect wasn't just given, it was earned. And when the time came, Bumpy would remind you of that, with or without the razor. It wasn't just about one man's pride, it was about a community's dignity. And sometimes it takes a legend to remind the world what respect really means.